Well, it happened. I finally got my hands on an 80s Fisher product, which means I can finally cover the enigma that is finding Fisher products at thrift stores. This is one of those brands that's viewed equally as great quality and terrible, depending on when it was made and, of course, who you ask. But the history of the company, and by extension the desirability of any given Fisher product, is kind of a tangled web. So today we're going to do a little shallow dive into Fisher as a company while we take a look at this little equalizer. Stick around. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds with this, I want to point out that this thing didn't work properly when I bought it. The right channel was almost completely non-functional and would cut out if you just looked at it wrong. So it needed to be repaired. I'll show you guys later how I did that, because it's actually something that, unless you know it's possible, you may not even realize that you can do yourself with hardly any tools. But let's talk about Fisher a little first. They were founded in the United States by Avery Fisher in 1945 as the Fisher Radio Corporation. From their inception until 1969, they focused on making really high-quality tube amps, consoles, radios, and speakers. Most of the stuff from that era is generally considered really good, although I have to admit I tend to avoid old tube equipment because it's vastly outside the scope of what I'm comfortable working on or have the tools for. The Fisher X-202, for example, you can't even begin to touch a working one of those as of writing this for less than $1,000, if you're lucky. Now, in 1969, Fisher sold his company to Emerson Electric. As a subsidiary of Emerson, Fisher seemed to continue to run more or less under the same engineering mindset as before, creating the best quality audio gear that they could, and we still got some really nice pieces of equipment out of it. But that only lasted a few years, because in 1975, Fisher was sold to Sanyo. Now, Sanyo did not just chuck the brand under the bus and immediately start cranking out terrible products. But what they did was shift Fisher toward a broader and more affordable consumer market. And that's all well and good, but the unfortunate consequence is that any respectability the name had in the minds of consumers was undermined by the fact that what they were putting out was just as hit and miss as any other mid-grade audio gear brand that it was competing with. So having the Fisher name attached to it was no longer a mark of guaranteed quality. Don't get me wrong, I tend to like Sanyo stuff. Nonetheless, it's hard to deny that once they took over, Fisher really wasn't the respected brand that it used to be. That doesn't mean that they didn't still make some interesting and decent stuff here and there, but it wasn't anywhere close to the gleaming Arkenstone it once was. The era that most people want or consider worth collecting is anything before 1975. Now, as a child of the 80s, I have a soft spot for equipment from their late era. It's nostalgic to me, and as I've stressed many times in the past on this channel, you're entitled to like whatever you like for whatever reason you like it, including stuff like this cheap 80s equalizer. But the Cliff's Notes version of all this is 1975 is when Sanyo bought Fisher, and that's generally considered the cutoff among hi-fi enthusiasts. This is the Fisher EQ-272. It was often sold as part of a rack system in 1985 and 86. Most of the time, you would see these components sold in a department store in a situation where they're expecting that you're buying a whole stereo package. You'd pick and choose the various matching components: amp, tuner, tape deck, equalizer, speakers, turntable if you're fancy. It was much less common to walk in and just pick up a single piece like this unless you were adding it to an existing rack system, at least from this line of products. There isn't a whole lot to talk about with this thing in terms of functions or quirks because, again, it was probably meant to be overshadowed by other pieces of equipment on the rack. It's very much a function over form situation. However, that same diminutive nature actually lends itself to a couple of things that I'd like to point out. For starters, let's look at the branding. This is labeled Studio Standard by Fisher. This, for anyone who doesn't have an intuition for dating a piece of equipment just by the industrial design alone, can serve to tell you which era this equipment hails from. Sanyo started applying this label shortly after acquiring the Fisher brand. Also, they're just calling it Fisher instead of the Fisher. That's another indication. Of course, being all black, plastic, and very 80s is another indicator. It's a 7-band graphic equalizer, which was at or near the bottom of their line of equalizers, all of which tended to have more advanced features and greeblies, most notably an increased number of sliders, LED lights on those sliders, and a spectrum analyzer. Having more sliders, in this particular case, pushed your control further down the spectrum, as well as giving finer control by having more bands within the same frequency range. This one has the fewest at only 7 per channel. The function of the sliders is pretty obvious, but the 3 operation buttons in the middle aren't as much so. You have a tape monitor and 2 EQ functions, on and off in the middle and record and off on the right. Those control 2 sets of inputs and outputs on the back. One is two pairs of very short hardwired RCA cables, and the other is a pair of RCA jacks. Here's where things get a little messy. If you use this equalizer, or any EQ for that matter, with most of the low to mid-range integrated amps and receivers that you're likely to encounter, you're not going to be able to retain the full functionality of everything in your setup. You have to place this in between a signal origin and its destination. In most cases, that's any given component and the amp or receiver. So, for example, a radio tuner or a CD player. The problem is, you don't get to make these adjustments to any of the other components in the system. You can also place this into the tape path. That allows you to make adjustments to either only the tape deck's output, or you can actually record the equalized signal directly to the tape itself if you should need to do that. Both of those capabilities are selected by these two buttons here. The tape monitor essentially acts just like a tape monitor on any amp or receiver. As I discussed in my previous equalizer video, you can also place this into one of your amplifier's tape monitor functions if it has two, and that will at least give you the ability to apply equalization to anything that you're listening to. But again, you're doing it at the sacrifice of being able to hook up a second tape deck, since this thing is using that slot instead. I guess you could daisy chain them, but that's not really what this was meant for. The ideal situation is if you have an access point between your preamplifier and the power amp. I haven't gone over those things before on here, so don't worry if you're not familiar with what that means. But in practice, it's basically a point in your signal path right before the section that actually amplifies the signal and routes it to your speakers. Integrated amplifiers have it as two pairs of RCA ports that look like this. This is where you would attach your equalizer. They have these little bars that bridge the two ports. You would just pull those out and plug your EQ in there. If you're lucky enough to be dealing with bigger separate pre and power amp units, you would just place this in between them. In either of those cases, you would retain the full functionality of not only this equalizer, but every other piece of equipment in your setup. Fisher, or I suppose Sanyo, anticipated this with at least a couple of the amps in their line at the time. The CA-275 and 276 both had the bridged RCA ports that would allow this to be fully integrated into your setup. And my assumption is your salesman would know that and encourage you to select the amp that allowed for that full integration when you were buying everything, if you were planning on getting an equalizer like this. It's worth noting that not all of the amps in their lineup had that same functionality. I'm not going to talk about separate preamps and power amps because that's an entire video topic for a later time. I'll explain how this hooks up when we do eventually cover that. For right now, all you need to know is that this sits in between different components in a signal path, and the three buttons in the front allow you to route the signals accordingly and either disengage or engage the equalization going to those endpoints. Now, I'm going to pivot for a second. This thing did not work correctly when I picked it up initially. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to any of you. $10 for a cheapo secondhand equalizer that's been separated from its flock is quite a glaring red flag. That said, this is such a simple unit that it's almost certainly fixable by anybody with any level of experience, with the caveat that you have the necessary tools. It was not playing out of the right side when I would engage the EQ function. That was actually good news because it meant that it was probably just a single break somewhere in the signal path, and if you look inside, you can see there's really not much there. The inside is mostly empty space.
You can put your
which is mostly because every component needed to be the same shape on top so that things could stack properly. This little board here is doing most of the work routing signals and supplying power. There are more components attached to where the sliders are in the front, but this is the easiest thing to access, so obviously I started there. I'm not going to walk through the whole process of diagnosing it because it's tedious and mostly because I was once again short-sighted and neglected to film it. If you'd like to see a full explanation of how I diagnose this thing, I will be posting that on my Patreon, which I just started a couple weeks ago. Just so you know, I really don't want to make this a sponsored channel. The last thing you guys need to hear is me extolling the merits of some product that we both know I don't use and don't actually care about. So instead, I started a Patreon with thrifting vlogs, electronics projects, behind the scenes stuff, and as it pertains to this video, a more in-depth explanation of diagnosing this equalizer. I'll leave it at that so this doesn't turn into one of those Sarah McLachlan animal commercials. What the problem turned out to be was simply these long bank switches. They had just gotten oxidized and needed to be cleaned. That looked like it would be a problem because they appear totally sealed. But they're not. They actually open. They even have a little slot on the end where you can pop them open. The short one has a little tab, but they all open up and it's nothing to hit them with contact cleaner, close them, cycle them several times, and they'll work perfectly after that. If that didn't fix it, or they started screwing up again after a while, I would probably desolder them from the board and drop them in the ultrasonic cleaner my boss gave me, which, thank you, Jose and Brianna. I use this thing all the time. I covered this more in depth on the Patreon, but the other possibility was a cracked or otherwise funky solder joint on the underside. That's also pretty common in older equipment and is a really easy fix. You would just resolder it. I was going to end the video there, but there's one more thing that kept eating at me, so I had to mention it. And it's these little R watermarks all over the PCB. I've never seen those before. It's not the first time I've seen a watermark on a phenolic substrate on a circuit board, but I've never seen this particular one. So if you've ever encountered it, I'd be very interested to know where you've seen it and who the manufacturer is that uses it. Honestly, mostly for curiosity's sake. So per my agreement from before, I have another album recommendation to share. This time, it's Conformicide by Havoc. Call me nuts, but I still love a good thrash album, and this one feels to me like a modern take on classic 80s and 90s thrash metal. It's very solid. So please, keep recommending stuff in the comments. The stuff you guys told me about last time, I really liked, like all of it. So let's do that again. That was fun. Also, consider signing up for the Patreon because it really, really helps. So I'll see you guys again in the next one. Keep thrifting.